I drove 14 hours to live with my mom, only to face emotional abuse. 2 months later, I left for my sister's, cutting off contact. OMG. Hello, friends. I am going to do my best to keep this brief, so grab your undergarments, prepare a rum and cola, and ready yourselves for a dive into the sea of nonsense. To set the scene for this chaos, my parents, 62 years old male and 62 years old female, are conservative Christians, believed the former president was a reincarnation of Christ, and have the misconception that all homosexuals are pedophiles. Now, let me introduce my siblings and my older sister, 27 years old female, who is the most flamboyant straight Christian you could ever encounter, my younger sibling, 23 years old non-binary, who applies the world's distress like makeup, and meet 25 years old gender fluid, who struggles to find a witty description for myself. Introductions are often the hardest part, aren't they? Now, on to the narrative, but where should I start? I could commence with how my mother emotionally and psychologically harmed my siblings and me when we began to express our independence as teenagers, or how she separated us from our father during our childhood because she believed he had acted inappropriately with my older sister, or how my dad did his utmost to condition us with his outdated notions of gender roles and prejudice against sexual minorities. But at this point, you grasp the essence of the situation. Everything took a turn for the worse when my parents informed me of their move to Florida. Do not inquire about the reasoning behind it, and that my mother would be residing there alone until my father retired for the second time. Once again, do not ask. I had recently endured an especially difficult breakup and felt the wanderlust typical of military children. Additionally, I wished to be near my mother. That's a triple, do not ask. But thought that since it had been a few years since our substantial arguments, which were frequent, not rare, we both had matured enough to overlook our disagreements. I was very mistaken. However, I did not realize this until I had packed my car with all my belongings, crammed both myself and my cat inside, and embarked on the 14-hour journey. Our disagreements during the 6 months I resided with her included, but were not limited to differing religious beliefs. She is a conservative Christian and I identify as a Celtic pagan. Sexuality, she identifies as a straight woman and I identify as gender fluid. Aspirations in life, she believed my life goal should be to marry a good Christian man, like her, and bear as many children as physically possible. While I aimed to establish a career and find love, in that specific order, and our perceptions of assistance, apparently clearing the overgrown garden in her backyard, scrubbing the tiles in that same backyard, removing a grotesque cover from her atrium, and relocating heavy furniture from one side of the house to another did not constitute sufficient help. Just to clarify, I am a petite person weighing 120 pounds soaking wet, which made these tasks quite challenging for me. It was challenging to secure employment in their area of Florida for most of the time I stayed with her, so I worked as a driver for a grocery delivery service, which she viewed as a waste of time and fuel. We agreed on that point, but it was the only opportunity I could find, so I was not in a position to be selective. At the midpoint of my stay, my mother sat me down and provided me with an ultimatum. You will never guess what it was. I had 2 months to either enroll in the college she selected, which I would have to pay for, with virtually no funds, or find a place for myself anywhere, as long as it was not under her roof. Because if I failed to leave by the final day of the second month, my mom would dispose of my belongings onto the street along with me. When I asked her where she expected me to go, she mentioned that there were several homeless shelters and halfway houses in Florida that I could attempt to access, but that, and I quote, it wasn't truly her concern. I'm not embarrassed to admit that I panicked for a while. During those 2 months, I scrambled for any job opportunities and eventually secured a part-time position at a restaurant. I quickly realized that with only a month and a half left on the countdown, I could not afford anything in their area of Florida. It was far too expensive for me. Thus, I began reaching out to friends and my siblings, finally striking gold with my older sister who stated that she, 27 years old female, and her roommate, 21 years old non-binary, would be delighted to have an additional roommate and to rescue me from the predicament I was in. Consequently, I stored everything I didn't need immediately and brought my cat with me to my sister's state. Thus commenced another 6 months of frantically searching for work, which ultimately led me to my current job. I am now faring much better, thank the deities. However, during this tumultuous period, my mother bombarded me with text messages to check in and see if I was all right. Still feeling somewhat irritated with her conduct while I lived with her, I didn't respond except for a few weary messages to inform her and my dad that I was okay. It was at this juncture that my sister recounted what she remembered about our mother taking us away from our dad. I was too young to recall this, and she shared that she hadn't truly comprehended it until our father revealed the details to her. A brief disclaimer: he only informed her of this because, during the pandemic, I had joined the military, and my recruiter had mentioned a public school we had attended. This is peculiar because, apart from one instance, I have only ever been homeschooled. This school enrollment was allegedly not the one I recall. My sibling was visiting us at this moment, and we all conversed about the situation, resulting in a very intense emotional reaction from them regarding our sister's narrative. Not so much at any memories that resurfaced, but rather at the fact that there were none. Regardless, while I held my sibling in my arms, feeling their entire body tremble from the intensity of their sobs, I resolved that I would not engage with my parents for the time being. My sister and my sibling concurred. Thus began our commitment to refraining from communication with our parents, with my sister requesting that we keep our father's revelations confidential for now. She aimed to wait until emotions had settled after their move to address the issue. What followed was the most outrageous gaslighting from my mother and subtle manipulation from my father that I had ever experienced. My mother claimed she didn't believe my wrongdoing stemmed from trying too hard, and that we simply did not care about her, so she would cease checking in on you girls. I would also like to emphasize that she and our dad absolutely refused to recognize my sibling as non-binary and constantly misgender and dead-name them. This infuriates me, even though my sibling has grown accustomed to it by now. But you know what is amusing about that message? She copied and pasted it, merely changing the names at the top to my sister and siblings' names. She couldn't muster the mental effort to craft a personalized message for the 3 children she claims to love so dearly. A few weeks went by, and my dad reached out to me, asking for my siblings' address. Remembering that they had expressed a desire not to communicate with him again, I confirmed with my sibling that they did not wish for him to have any information. They agreed. I replied to my dad, stating that they did not wish to speak to him or receive anything from him. Thus began the most awkward conversation, as I attempted to convey to my father the various ways he had failed us during our upbringing, deliberately omitting the most apparent and significant issue of our mother separating us from him. I told him unequivocally that my sibling had no interest in communicating with him. Ever. And when he inquired what I wanted him to communicate to my mother, I instructed him to say nothing, that we were all in the process of drafting letters outlining our feelings and what we desired from our relationships with her. I made it clear that none of us wanted to engage with either of them until we felt secure that they would accept our messages. He claimed to understand, but either I failed to convey my message clearly or he simply did not care. For the following 2 weeks, he attempted to reach my sibling by every means available. He called and texted their number, reached out to their former roommate, and employed all possible tactics. I documented everything, but nothing compared to the Christmas letter we received from our mother, who hadn't attempted to contact us since her gaslighting effort. I will include it here, dear, older sister, and my name. My gift this Christmas, I ask you to forgive me for all things I have or have not done that have offended you. I also forgive you for all that you have done against me. I pray the God of peace will free us from all bitterness and selfishness as we trust in him our hope and joy and crown of rejoicing. Love, Mom, joy to the world the Lord has come, wishing you all the blessings of the season. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. Hebrews 11:12 Peace and love, Mama and Papa. I understand that the grammar is incorrect, but I wanted to convey her words as faithfully as possible. Anyway, as letters are her preferred mode of communication with us, I plan to send her and my dad a letter detailing the ways she has influenced me and my relationships with everything God, my siblings, my friends, and most importantly, her. Everyone I have shared this with predicts that she will not respond positively. And honestly, I do not anticipate that either. But I want my words to linger in her mind so that both she and my father can see on paper exactly what they have done, along with my own ultimatum: pursue therapy, address their issues, and move beyond their deeply rooted homophobia, sexism, and religious biases. Regardless, I truly doubt either of them knows what Reddit is or how it operates, and considering they would never dare to utter the word asshole, I feel confident they will not discover this on their own. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to any suggestions you may have for my siblings and me, and I will strive to keep you all informed. But I have one final question for everyone. Am I the one at fault? Story 2. I moved my uncle's HVAC junk onto my land, he trespassed, and got arrested. The ultimate revenge against a petty brother. My uncle has consistently been a self-righteous, petty individual with a terrible temper and an inflated sense of his own significance, yet he possesses little to no intelligence. My father has always tried to endure his behavior and maintain harmony because family matters greatly to him. This account describes how my uncle finally overstepped his bounds and ultimately faced arrest for his actions. The narrative is quite extensive, as it spans several months of their conflict. As a bit of context, my father and my uncle are neighbors in a rural community of around 600 residents. My father constructed the house my uncle resides in and sold it along with a small parcel of land. Consequently, my father's remaining property totals approximately 6 acres, which runs along the side and back of my uncle's smaller lot. My uncle works as a dealer for HVAC systems. Although my father is also in the HVAC business, he occasionally purchased items from his brother, despite his brother's higher prices and limited inventory compared to other suppliers, in order to support him. Additionally, my father rented a building owned by my uncle, which served as his shop and office. Although my father rented only the building and parking area, both he and my uncle collected old HVAC units in the field behind the shop. These units are rusty and generally unattractive, but when they lacked other tasks, they would dismantle these old units for scrap. The story begins one day when my father approached his brother, requesting a specific unit. However, my uncle quoted him an exorbitant price and could not deliver it within the time frame my father required. Therefore, my father contacted another supplier he works with, who happened to have a unit available at a significantly lower cost. It was a clear decision. Somehow, my uncle caught wind of this. Individuals in the HVAC industry appear to gossip extensively, and confronted my father, presenting an ultimatum: if my father did not agree to purchase all of his units from him, my uncle would refuse to sell him anything. I have already indicated that my uncle lacks common sense. Consequently, my father chose not to reply to his brother, but he took him at his word and ceased making any purchases from him. Shortly thereafter, my uncle arrived at my father's shop, demanding to know why my father had not placed any orders that month. Upon learning the reason for this, my uncle erupted in anger. They reportedly engaged in a heated exchange, and eventually, my uncle declared that my father was no longer his brother, that they would no longer conduct business together, and that my father was evicted from the shop. I should clarify that, legally, my father was not evicted, as that would have necessitated legal notification and a specific notice period. However, my father had enough of the situation, so he agreed and began converting the barn on his property into his new shop. A few days later, my uncle, who likely thought my father would not take action, returned to the shop and demanded that my father remove all of the old HVAC units situated in the field behind the building or face a lawsuit for the cost of their removal. This demand likely held no legal standing, since my father's lease applied only to the building, not the field, and my uncle had contributed to and used the old units as communal assets. When my father gets angry, he truly gets angry. So he consented to relocate the old units. He took his tractor, loaded each unit onto his flatbed trailer, drove behind his barn, and meticulously arranged hundreds of rusty, unattractive HVAC units just an inch or two from the property line at the back of my uncle's house. It is worth noting that my father could not view these old units from his home due to the layout of his property, but my uncle had a clear view of them from his backyard. My uncle began behaving even more creepily than usual, constantly spying on my father's house. In response, my father decided to build a privacy fence along the side of his property that borders my uncle's land, but not at the back, where the HVAC units are located. The fence construction team arrived and worked for several hours until my uncle abruptly drove into his driveway and jumped out of his truck, already yelling because the unfortunate fence installers had temporarily placed posts or tools on his side of the property line while constructing the fence. My uncle contacted the police, who informed the fence crew to refrain from placing anything on the disgruntled man's property, and then left. The following day, it seems someone inadvertently left a hammer across the property line, prompting my uncle to scream at the workers once more. He called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the crew had already moved the hammer, leaving them irritable and only able to issue a warning not to repeat the mistake. Later that same afternoon, my uncle contacted the police for a third time, if you can believe it. This time, he accused my father of stealing a backhoe, the kind that attaches to the back of a tractor. Ironically, my uncle had given this backhoe to my father 2 years earlier because he did not even possess a tractor sufficient to use it. The officer was far from amused when this revelation emerged, and since it was the same officer who had responded earlier that day, her annoyance level heightened. My father helpfully suggested, "Come and collect the backhoe if you want it," fully aware that my uncle had no means to transport the machine even those few feet to his own yard. My uncle countered that my father was merely attempting to trap him and would accuse him of trespassing if he stepped onto my father's property. Despite the fact that the officer was present when my father made the offer, and this whole exchange occurred in my father's driveway. He then expressed his desire to file a complaint against my father that effectively served as a restraining order, though it is not a formal restraining order since it lacks a judge's endorsement. The police treat such complaints in that manner, aimed at habitual trespassers. The officer, annoyed, informed my father that this would mean that even if my uncle texted or emailed him inviting him to discuss matters, my father could potentially be arrested for trespassing if his uncle called the police or captured a photo of him on his land. My father declared his intention to file a complaint against his brother as well. The moment for poetic justice has arrived. My father was fully aware that his brother had no genuine comprehension of the property lines and was unlikely to retrieve his survey to verify them. My uncle only knew where the boundaries were because my father diligently maintains wooden markers along his property lines. So, when my uncle went away for a few days, my father moved all of the old HVAC units a few feet further onto his property and relocated the markers accordingly. Essentially, it appeared as though the property line had shifted several feet back than it actually was. He then placed a random scrap piece across the newly created boundary, still on his own property, but it created the illusion of being across the line if judged solely by the improperly placed markers. Set up a few game cameras focused on the line, and waited. Sure enough, his clueless brother soon exploded out of his house as soon as he noticed this scrap on his side of the property line. He crossed onto my father's land for a closer look at the scrap and called the police. My father was ready for their arrival with his survey indicating the true property line, a copy of the report issued by the annoyed officer, and footage from his game cameras showing his brother clearly trespassing on his property, resulting in the arrest of my uncle. The only way this revenge could have been sweeter for my father would have been if the same annoyed officer had been the one to show up to arrest my uncle. But instead, he was arrested by someone they both knew from high school, which was especially embarrassing for my uncle, who was informed that the entire town would hear about it. Edited to add nothing significant developed from my uncle's arrest, or at least nothing my father has learned about, and he would certainly find out since this is a small community of around 600 residents. However, it was probably humiliating enough for my uncle to have been cuffed, spent a night in jail, and to have others aware of the situation because he has not caused my father any additional distress, aside from occasionally seeing his truck drive past. My uncle is currently embroiled in a business dispute with his sister-in-law and brother-in-law, so likely he seeks to vent his frustrations on a different target who has not already outperformed him, not to mention someone who is not his older, significantly larger brother who has been inclined to physically confront him throughout their lives. Recently, my uncle, aunt, cousin, and my cousin's wife all unfriended me on social platforms, so I only learn about their activities through small-town gossip. A while ago, my sister was driving down the road, spotted my uncle in his yard, and waved at him. He turned away as if he did not recognize her. None of us received any announcement when my cousin's wife recently had her baby. Therefore, it appears that my uncle and his family have chosen to ignore our existence, though he seems too fearful to do anything beyond pretending we are all invisible. Story 3. I was left 250 miles from home after an entitled apprentice vanished during load-out, forcing his dad to do a 500-mile round trip. Goodness, I was reminded of this tale after a recent conversation with an old acquaintance. It is quite lengthy, so I apologize in advance. It combines elements of both our pro-revenge and our entitled people. Several years ago, I secured a position at a weekend music festival. It was fairly straightforward 10 bands each day, all typical rock and roll music. The boss assigned 4 of us to the job: myself, Dreadful Boris, Big Chris, and Hammer. He also mentioned that we would be bringing along an apprentice, a young man who happened to be the son of a local promoter. It's always beneficial to have an extra set of hands, and it's great to assist in training the next generation after all. That's how we learned in earlier times. As it turned out, this young man was about as effective as a scuba tank to a fish and possessed an entitlement complex that rivaled that of a mid-size African nation. During our journey in the truck, he was bragging about how he was a really skilled sound engineer, and that he could probably teach us a few techniques. Oh, is that so? We arrived at the venue and quickly began unloading the truck. We had a 16-ton truck filled to capacity with 2 sound desks and roughly 16 kW of sound equipment for the front of house, plus about 6 kW of monitors. As you can imagine, this is quite heavy gear, and it required all of us to safely unload and organize it, except that, after we offloaded the first amp rack, which, although it was on wheels, still weighed around 80 kilos, the entitled brat haughtily proclaimed, "I'm a sound engineer, not a manual laborer," and immediately walked away. Okay. Well, we didn't really require him complicating matters. We were all accustomed to handling boxes, and about an hour later, we had the rig set up and secured, ran the multicore to the front of house desk, and were ready to begin cabling and connecting power to the on-site generator. Out of nowhere, the spotty oik appeared from whatever hole he had hidden himself in and asked what he could do. I replied, "I'm going to set up the front of house. Perhaps you could assist Hammer in cabling the speakers." "I don't take instructions from women." Quick interjection: Hammer stood at 5'9", was stunningly beautiful, and as tough as they come, hence her nickname. She was also an exceptional front-of-house engineer and a fantastic friend. Boris, Chris, and I collectively sighed inwardly and braced ourselves for a full-on rebuttal from Hammer. "Seriously, folks, you do not mess with her unless you are prepared for significant consequences." Instead, she smiled sweetly, never a positive sign, and said, "Well, I'm sure you'll learn something valuable." I then went off to work with cables at the front of house, while Boris and Chris concentrated on the monitors. A while later, I returned to the stage. The spotty oik had wandered off again. Hammer wore a resigned expression. "What happened?" I asked. It turned out that, despite the cables and connector ports being clearly labeled, the oik managed to create chaos while connecting the amp racks. Trust me, it's extremely difficult to make such an error. I located the oik a few moments later and informed him that he was not following the correct procedure, and that if he was unsure about what to do, he should always ask one of us first. What came out of his mouth utterly baffled me. "I don't need to learn all that nonsense. I'm a sound engineer." Blink Hammer, who stood just a few feet away, snorted in disbelief and rolled her eyes. It took me a moment to process this particular nugget of ignorance. Well, you must know how all of this operates. It's fundamental to the job, and since you're here to learn, I recommend that you pay attention. "Well, you're merely a bunch of roadies. What do you know?" Upon delivering this charming remark, he sauntered off, once more, leaving me to pick my jaw up off the ground while Hammer struggled to contain laughter that could have incapacitated a rhinoceros. I suspect this fool believed he would be running the front of house flawlessly throughout the event. About an hour later, we were all set up, and we had a good idea of the acts scheduled to perform. In such situations, it is uncommon to have a full sound check, so you must rely on experience to set up the desk from scratch. Fortunately, we managed to get the first act on stage 30 minutes prior to the start, allowing me to quickly gauge the overall setup. For context, I find it convenient to reuse channels across various acts, so I typically reserve the first 20 channels for drums, bass, and guitars, and the last 6 for vocals. If a band arrives with anything out of the ordinary percussion, brass instruments, Tibetan musical instruments, etc., we assign them to channels in the middle. This approach keeps things simple and consistent, which becomes significant shortly. The workflow during the performance is also straightforward. Dreadful Boris and Big Chris run the monitor desk, while Hammer and I manage the front of house. We each take 2 acts before switching, which helps prevent fatigue on our ears, and when we aren't operating the desk, we coordinate stage setups for each act, troubleshoot as needed, and run errands for food and coffee in between. We also assign the spotty oik to assist with the stage setups, which quickly proved problematic. We completed the first act and aimed to accomplish the turnover within 15 minutes. Typically, the incoming act communicates their microphone requirements, and we draft a mic plot that is then sent to the front of house desk. The spotty oik shows up with the mic plot and goes back to assist with the stage setup. As I check each microphone, I realize I cannot hear the vocal channels. No sooner had I noticed this than Dreadful Boris contacted me via intercom and asked if I could hear the vocal channels. He couldn't either. He then headed off to check the stage box where all the microphones were connected. From quite a distance, I heard him exclaim, "What the hell?" Moments later, he was back on the intercom. "Do you know what that ridiculous fool has done?" He only repatched all the vocal channels so that all the plugs on the stage box are lined up neatly one after the other, his own words. Good grief. Boris quickly reconnected the microphones, and we were prepared to go again. A few hours later, I was beginning my second shift at front of house. I won't bore you with my experiences managing the spotty oik during the stage shift, which let's just say was interesting. Currently, on stage, is a rather talented jazz septet. I enjoy working with jazz. Give me a good 20-piece big band, and I am in my element. In strolls he who shall not be named and asks, "When can I try mixing?" I'm exceptionally good, you know. Since he was here to learn, I informed him he could handle the next act under my supervision. This act happened to be an acoustic duo, 2 guitars and 2 vocals. Even the most inexperienced engineer should be able to manage something so straightforward. Correct? Wrong. I had already established what I felt was a reasonable baseline on the faders for him to work with. The very first thing he did was reach for the master faders and crank up an additional 15 dB nuo. Instantly, the rig teetered on the brink of feedback, and I swiftly pulled back the mains. Look and listen, balance the 2 vocal parts, then the guitars, and leave the mains untouched. He then began making wildly inappropriate adjustments to the channel's equalization once more. The rig started to squeak. All right, that's enough. I pushed him aside and regained control. I will not overload you with the endless list of blunders and attitudes he displayed throughout the rest of the weekend. Suffice it to say that despite the best efforts of both Hammer and myself to teach this individual, our attempts were futile. Coupled with the constant trickle of snide remarks about how he was really a superior engineer compared to the rest of us, by the end of the weekend, we were all rather frustrated. At the conclusion of the event, it was time to tackle the fun part of dismantling the rig and loading out. I'm being sarcastic about the fun part, by the way. After 2 exhausting days, we were all exhausted, and the last thing we wanted to do was pack up, but of course it had to be done. It's always an all-hands-on-deck scenario, except the spotty oik has, once again, vanished. After 2 grueling hours, we finally finished and loaded the truck to head home. But where was the spotty oik? Nowhere. We waited a good 15 minutes, no luck. We then decided to search for him, spending another 20 minutes wandering the site. Yet again, he had disappeared. We returned to the truck now close to 3 a.m. and almost simultaneously said, "Forget him." We climbed back in and drove the 250 miles back to the warehouse to unload. The next afternoon, the boss called me to find out why we had left the spotty oik behind. I provided him with a brief summary and was informed that the oik had to contact his father at 3 in the morning to come retrieve him a 500-mile round trip. He then stated, "I never liked that promoter anyway. He was consistently late with payments on previous gigs. The next time he reaches out wanting a crew and rig, I think I'll tell him to forget it.